Story 1. It was the summer of 2019, and I was home from college for a few months. I had just finished my sophomore year and was excited to come home for a while and make some money before going back to college in the fall. My mom's friend Beth was looking for a babysitter for her 4-year-old son Mason, a couple evenings a week. Beth and her husband Steve both worked at a law firm in the next town over and were often at dinner events for work. I thought this would be the perfect way to make some cash without having to commit to a rigid work schedule. Beth was excited when I agreed to watch Mason and said I came highly recommended from my mom. This would be my 5th or 6th time babysitting Mason. He was a shy kid but very sweet and obedient, which made him pretty easy to watch. He was satisfied just playing with his toys or watching a movie. Steve and Beth asked that I arrive by 5:30 p.m. before they left for the evening. They said they anticipated being home around 10 or 11 p.m. and that Mason should be in bed by 9 p.m. I got to their house right at 5:30 and Steve and Beth were just about ready to head out. They gave me the rundown of his schedule for the evening. He had a snack when he got home from daycare around 4:30 p.m, so I just needed to make sure he ate a decent dinner. They suggested heating up one of the frozen pizzas in the freezer or making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Mason came downstairs to say bye to his parents and then plopped himself on the couch ready to watch TV. I heated up a small pizza for him and we ate together in the living room. After he finished up, Mason said he had to use the bathroom. He was gone for a couple minutes, then came back looking a little spooked. He asked me if I heard noises coming from the basement. I was confused at first because the TV was on. But when I muted it, I could faintly make out some shuffling happening underneath us. It didn't sound like rats or mice scurrying about. This was larger, like a person moving boxes. Mason looked terrified, so I tried to assure him everything was probably fine. I told him to wait on the couch while I quickly went to check the basement. The shuffling noises had stopped at this point. I felt nervous going down there alone, especially knowing Mason was scared. Their basement door was in the kitchen toward the back of the house. I don't think I had ever even been down there since it was mainly used for storage. I slowly opened the door and turned on the light at the top of the stairs. I tried stepping lightly as I made my way down, then flipped on the second light at the bottom. The large unfinished space was mostly filled with boxes and furniture, making it feel cramped. I did a lap around the perimeter, peeking behind some of the larger items, but couldn't find anything suspicious. After a few minutes of snooping, the basement was silent, and I felt silly for letting Mason freak me out over what was likely nothing. I went back upstairs and saw Mason sitting upright on the couch. I plopped down next to him and gave him a big reassuring hug. I told him the basement was empty and the noises were probably just the pipes settling or something. He seemed relieved, and we soon forgot about the whole spooky ordeal. The next couple hours flew by as we played with his toy dinosaurs, watched some cartoons, and built mega block towers. It wasn't long before his bedtime was approaching. At about 8:45, I brought Mason upstairs to get him ready for bed. We read a story, brushed teeth, and said goodnight. After making sure his nightlight was on, I headed back downstairs feeling confident the rest of the night would be uneventful. I settled onto the couch and mindlessly scrolled through my phone. It had to have been 30 or 40 minutes before I heard the basement door creak open. My heart dropped. Then came the unmistakable sounds of rustling and movement from below. It was much louder than before. I sat paralyzed trying to rationalize what I was hearing. Maybe it was just the house settling, or the wind outside could be making things shift around in the basement. But then I heard Mason's door open upstairs, followed by his tiny voice calling my name. My protective instincts kicked in. I hurried to the bottom of the stairs and called out for him to stay in his room and not come down here. The shuffling noises grew louder, clearly coming from a person concealing themselves down there. But I knew I had to check now, knowing Mason could come down any minute. I pulled my phone from my pocket and had 911 keyed and ready to call. Slowly turning the knob, I flipped on the light to reveal the same basement from earlier. Except this time, the noises were intensifying near the bottom of the stairs. My heart was pounding in my ears as I creaked down each step. Then about halfway down, I saw movement behind some boxes in the left corner. In a split-second decision, I ran back up the stairs, slammed the door shut, and locked it. Still hearing Mason above, I sprinted up to get him and ushered him outside through the front door. We crossed the street where I finally called 911 with shaking hands. Mason was crying, asking about what was happening. I tried to stay calm and told him the police were on their way to make sure nothing bad was in the basement. I also called Steve and Beth to brief them on the situation. They were terrified and said they'd drop what they were doing to get home right away. We sat together on the curb waiting anxiously for the police to arrive. It took about 15 minutes before 2 patrol cars came speeding down the road. 2 officers approached us while the others went inside. I quickly explained how I was babysitting and heard the noises from the basement, so we rushed outside and called them. The officers questioned me for any other details while we stood outside. About 10 minutes later, a policeman opened the front door and waved us over, saying it was okay to come back inside. He reassured us that whoever was in the basement must have fled when they heard me call 911. But they did find makeshift bedding, trash, and food wrappers stashed behind the boxes. It was clear someone had been living down there without the homeowners knowing. Just then, Steve and Beth pulled into the driveway looking completely distraught. They ran up and hugged Mason first, making sure he was okay. I was still really shaken up, but managed to tell them again what had happened. The police suspected it was probably a drifter who found a way into their unused basement and was living there in secret. The family was completely horrified knowing someone had been in their house this whole time without their knowledge. After the police finished sweeping the home and taking stock of the basement, I was finally allowed to leave around 10:30 p.m. once Mason's grandparents arrived to be with them. The next few days were a complete blur. I barely slept thinking about how things could have ended so badly. Why didn't I check the basement more thoroughly earlier in the night? Should I have called 911 sooner? It felt traumatic realizing the man had likely been under the same roof as me and Mason all evening. I decided to stop in and check on the family the day after. They were still on edge, but said the police had upped patrols around the neighborhood overnight. However, there were no leads yet on finding the trespasser. They had also scheduled a security system installation for the following week. I could tell they were still processing the violation of having a stranger living in their home. Beth gave me a big hug and thanked me again for keeping Mason safe once I realized something wasn't right. Over the next couple weeks, I kept in regular contact with Beth for any updates, but sadly it seemed the man who had been hiding out there remained at large. The police could not find fingerprints or any way to identify him. It was as if he had vanished that night without a trace. Beth said she and Steve debated moving because they were so creeped out but couldn't afford it right now. While they tried to return to normal life, I found myself looking over my shoulder more and feeling unsafe. I quit my babysitting jobs as the experience left me pretty scared. I also started double-checking every closet and crevice whenever I was in someone else's house. For all I knew, this guy was still lurking, hiding, and invading people's homes. Maybe he would never be caught and was getting bolder. The thought of it all made me shudder. I was thankful to be leaving Willow Creek soon to return to college. Hopefully focusing on my classes and being around friends would help me move past this terrifying ordeal. But I still think back often on that night and wonder how different it could have been if I had just taken Mason's fear seriously from the start. Perhaps we could have avoided the whole traumatic situation. I'm grateful it wasn't worse, but the what-ifs will probably always haunt me. Wherever that man disappeared to, I hope he got the help he clearly needed and never repeated something so dangerous. No family should have to go through the invasion of their privacy and security like Steve and Beth did. Even several years later, I am extra vigilant about unexplained noises or signs something is off. After living through that experience as a babysitter, I don't think I will ever feel completely safe from the potential darkness lurking right under our noses. Story 2. It was mid-July, and I was home in the small town of Willow Creek, Oregon. My best friend Jenna had asked if I could watch her 7-year-old daughter Bella for a couple days while she went on a business trip to San Francisco. I was happy to help out and make a little extra money before the fall semester started. Jenna and Bella lived about 15 minutes outside of town in a beautiful 2-story home surrounded by lush forests and rolling mountains. Their nearest neighbors were at least a mile down the winding roads, so they enjoyed the peace and quiet of being somewhat secluded. I'd always liked staying at their place because it felt so serene and relaxing compared to the business of campus life. On Monday morning, I packed a small bag, then headed over to their house. Jenna and I chatted for a bit when I arrived. Then we ate a light lunch together with Bella before Jenna had to leave to catch her flight. She went over Bella's routine and said she should be in bed by 9 p.m. at the latest. I told her not to worry about a thing and to enjoy her trip and work meetings. After Jenna left, Bella and I played in her room with her dolls for a little while. She then excitedly told me about her dance class and new friends she had made in 2nd grade. Around dinner time, we got in the car to pick up some food from her favorite local pizza spot. We also stopped for ice cream sundaes afterwards, which felt like a fun treat. We got back to the house just before 8 p.m. I asked Bella if she wanted to watch a movie before bedtime, which she happily agreed to. As she looked through the options, I went to the kitchen to wash the ice cream bowls. When I returned to the living room, Bella asked in a puzzled voice, "Who's that?" I followed her gaze toward the front door, where I could see a shadowy figure through the window blinds. Before I could process what was happening, there was a loud knock at the door. My heart rate spiked as I cautiously approached the door. Living so far out with no one else around, we never had unexpected visitors, especially this late. I slowly opened the door with the chain locks still attached. There was a tall, ragged-looking man staring back at me. He seemed surprised when I appeared, as if he didn't think anyone was home. After an awkward silence, I nervously asked if I could help him. He leaned to the side, trying to peek into the house before replying in a gruff tone, "Oh, sorry, just making sure someone was home." Without another word, he turned abruptly and walked off the porch toward the dirt road. I quickly shut the door and locked it, then did the same for the back door in the kitchen. Bella asked who it was with concern in her voice. I tried to downplay the weird encounter and told her it was probably just a lost hiker looking for directions. I turned on the movie Moana to distract her, but I was still feeling really unsettled. We were here all alone, and some shady man shows up out of nowhere at night. It gave me the creeps, but I stayed calm for Bella's sake. We cuddled up on the couch together under a blanket to watch the movie. Before I knew it, Bella had fallen asleep curled up next to me. I hadn't realized how long the movie was until I checked the time and saw it was almost 11 p.m. I carefully adjusted Bella so I could get up without waking her. I decided not to move her yet and let her sleep since she looked so peaceful. I turned off the TV and just sat there in the now silent living room, processing the eerie events from earlier. I couldn't imagine who that man was or what he wanted by coming to such a remote house this late at night. I considered calling Jenna to mention it, but didn't want to worry her when she was probably sleeping. My thoughts were suddenly interrupted by a loud crunching sound coming from the backyard. I froze, listening intently. The noise continued, sounding like heavy footsteps on the gravel walkway. I quietly got up and crept toward the back door, turning on the outside light. Peering out into the darkness, I couldn't see anything amiss in the backyard except for the swaying trees. The motion lights illuminated the covered porch and firewood stacks, but nothing seemed disturbed. After a few painfully long minutes of silence, I decided I must be getting paranoid. I went back to check on Bella, who was still fast asleep, before going upstairs to the guest room to try and get some rest myself. I had trouble falling asleep, unable to stop replaying the night's events in my mind. The isolation of the house at night, combined with the unsettling encounter with a stranger, had me feeling anxious. Finally, exhaustion took over and I managed to drift off into a restless sleep around 1 a.m. I awoke suddenly to the sound of footsteps outside on the gravel walkway again. Still groggy, I fumbled to turn on the bedside lamp and looked at the clock, which read 3:14 a.m. The crunching sound was louder and more distinct this time. I crept to the guest room window, which faced the side yard, and slowly lifted a corner of the curtain to peer outside. I couldn't see anyone in the darkness, but the footsteps were clearly coming from right below me now, alongside the house. My hands shaking, I grabbed my phone from the nightstand. I went out into the hall and quietly called Bella's name. Getting no response, I sighed in relief that she was still asleep. I walked cautiously down the stairs, fully prepared to call 911. But just as I reached the last step, the noises stopped abruptly. Complete silence filled the house once again. I stood like a statue for several minutes, waiting to hear any movement. After what felt like ages of nothing, I finally convinced myself it must have been an animal rummaging around. I went to the kitchen and got some water, trying to calm my nerves. I kept replaying the sounds over and over, feeling certain they were made by large footsteps, not some raccoon or possum. As much as I wanted to deny it, I had a terrible feeling someone was lurking right outside the house while we slept. I checked that all the doors were double locked before returning upstairs, but sleep felt impossible now. I lay awake watching the clock tick by slowly. I only managed to doze off again once the first light of dawn crept in through the window. I dragged myself out of bed the next morning, exhausted from my sleepless night. Bella bounced downstairs full of energy, chattering away about the fun movies and activities she wanted to do today. As we sat down to breakfast, she causally asked, "Why were you walking around outside so much last night?" I froze, my drowsiness instantly replaced with alarm. Trying to stay calm, I asked what exactly she saw or heard. She replied, "I woke up because I heard someone walking back and forth outside my window for a long time after you put me to bed." My heart dropped into my stomach. I told Bella to stay put while I quickly went to check things outside. I did a full sweep of the perimeter, but saw no immediate signs of an intruder. However, upon closer inspection, I noticed faint scratches marking the outside walls near several windows and doors. The gravel walkways also had some freshly disturbed areas that could have been footprints. Just as I was headed back inside, I saw a figure emerging from the tree line of the road. To my horror, I realized it was the same man from the previous night, ambling casually past the house like someone out on a leisurely stroll. The surrounding area was all dense forest and mountains for miles with barely a neighbor in sight. So there was absolutely no logical reason for him to be walking way out here unless he was specifically coming to Jenna's house. I rushed back inside and told Bella we were going on an impromptu adventure to the city mall today. I tried to make it sound fun and spontaneous, but I honestly just wanted to get us out of the isolated house as soon as possible. We drove the 30 minutes into town, where I knew we could stay in crowded public places until it got late enough to check into a hotel. We wandered the shops all afternoon until dinner time. Jenna called around 5 p.m. to check in and see how things were going. I hesitated for a moment, but finally told her about the creepy man appearing twice now along with the sounds of someone lurking outside late at night. She gasped when I described his ragged clothes and gaunt face. Apparently a man matching the same description had come to their door a few weeks prior asking if he could stay the night. Jenna had quickly refused, but didn't think much of it afterwards, since drifters weren't uncommon in the rural area. But knowing he returned and had been skulking around the property clearly meant his intentions were malicious. Jenna pleaded with me to call the police if anything else seemed strange and to get to a safe place for the night. After we hung up, I decided to book a hotel room in town, instead of returning to the isolated house again after dark. Bella and I grabbed some fast food for dinner and watched TV in the hotel until their bedtime. I made sure the door was double locked and wedged a chair under the handle as an extra precaution before we went to sleep. Jenna called first thing in the morning to let me know her flight had just landed back in Portland. She would head straight to the house from the airport, which was about an hour drive. I told Bella we were going on a special breakfast adventure and surprised her with a trip through the McDonald's drive-thru before heading back out of town. We pulled up to the house just as Jenna was arriving. The three of us did a cautious walkthrough together to make sure there were no unwanted visitors inside before deeming it safe. Jenna made breakfast for us, and we talked over the frightening events of the past 2 days. Though I still felt shaken up, I didn't want Bella to see me upset. After a few hours of visiting, I gave them both big hugs, then made the drive back home, feeling relief as I left the isolation of the forest behind. Over the next month, Jenna kept me updated on the situation. The police suspected the man was scouting out remote homes to rob, but nothing in the house had been disturbed. She decided to install a high-tech security system just for peace of mind. For several weeks, there were no further signs of the unnerving drifter. Then in mid-August, Jenna called to let me know the man had been arrested after trying to break into a neighbor's house 20 miles away. He was identified as a transient with a long criminal record of petty thefts and home invasions stretching across multiple states. Though he never admitted why he targeted Jenna's home, she suspected the seclusion and made it an easy opportunity. I still feel uneasy when I think back to that night I heard his footsteps circling outside in the darkness. As a young woman alone with a child, we were lucky things didn't end up far worse. I'll never know what exactly his intentions were, or what he would have done had he found his way inside. But the chill down my spine reminds me that evil can lurk closer than you ever imagine, even in the places you think are safe. Story 3. Growing up in the small town of Ashland, weekends could feel long and dull once I entered my teen years. When I was 13, my mom Sarah started working a part-time job at a restaurant in town every Saturday evening to earn some extra income. Since my dad traveled frequently for work, this meant I needed a babysitter to watch me for those 5 to 6 hours each week. I felt too old for a babysitter at this point, and hated the lack of independence. All I wanted was to be left alone to hang out with friends, play video games, and make snacks without adult supervision. But my mom insisted I still needed someone there for safety, since I would be home alone at night. The main sitter she relied on was a 20-year-old guy named Caleb, who was the son of one of her co-workers. I immediately got weird vibes from him, though my mom assured me he came highly recommended. He was awkward and standoffish whenever he came over, but in front of my mom, he would become suddenly chatty and animated. I complained to my mom that I thought Caleb was creepy, and I didn't want him watching me anymore, but she brushed it off saying I just wanted to get rid of him so I could have the place to myself. No matter how much I insisted something felt off about him, my mom trusted her friend's recommendation since Caleb had no issues babysitting other kids. One Saturday in late October, Caleb arrived right at 6:30 p.m., just as my mom was gathering her things to leave for work. They made their usual small talk by the door for a few minutes before my mom headed out, telling me to be good and that she'd be home around midnight. I plopped myself on the couch and turned on the Xbox, resigned to another boring night of Caleb, just awkwardly keeping to himself. Around 9 or 10 was my normal weekend bedtime, so I had several hours to kill. Most times, Caleb would sit in the kitchen or upstairs lounge area, never talking to me or bothering me. And tonight started off no different. After about 15 minutes of playing video games in silence, I suddenly heard hushed voices coming from the kitchen. I hit pause, listening closely to see if I could make out the conversation, but the words were too muffled to understand. This struck me as very odd. Who would Caleb be talking to? He never chatted on the phone or anything when he babysat me. The kitchen was just on the other side of the wall behind the living room couch, so I strained to decipher the whispering, but it was no use. This went on for maybe 5 minutes before I heard footsteps and Caleb came around the corner. Looking annoyed, he told me in a flat tone that someone was going to stop by for a minute, but not to worry about it. I just nodded, unsure of what to think. This was definitely against protocol, and I doubted my mom would approve of Caleb having random visitors over. But I also knew it wasn't my place to argue with a 13-year-old. The next half hour or so was painfully uncomfortable as Caleb paced around the living room in silence. Normally, he avoided being in the same space as me, so I didn't understand why he was just lingering here. I kept playing my game, trying not to show my nervousness. Eventually, a car pulled up outside and Caleb sprang out from the couch. There was a knock at the front door directly behind where I was sitting. Caleb stood positioned right in front of the door and told me he'd just be a minute before stepping outside and closing it behind him. My curiosity got the better of me. I crept over to peek out the window, moving the blinds just enough to observe 2 shadowy figures talking. I could tell Caleb was holding some kind of bag or package while speaking to a man who then got back into his car and drove off down the street. Seconds later, I heard the lid of our garbage can slam shut outside. Caleb re-entered looking tense and on edge. I hesitantly asked what that was all about. "Oh, just my friend returning my wallet I left at his place," he mumbled unconvincingly. I knew he was lying but didn't press the issue further. I was mostly just eager for this odd night to be over with, but things only got more bizarre as the hours ticked by. Caleb proceeded to have multiple hushed phone calls in the kitchen over the next 45 minutes or so. At one point his voice grew loud and angry, like he was arguing with someone. Soon that same car returned, pulling up hastily in our driveway. The driver approached Caleb, who was already standing outside waiting for him. Through the window I could see them gesturing tensely. After a heated back and forth, Caleb went over to our trash cans, retrieved the mystery bag from earlier, and thrust it at the man. He sped off into the darkness, and Caleb came back inside looking even more on edge. He paced around muttering under his breath before marching upstairs. He didn't come back down until right at 10 p.m, when he curtly reminded me to go to bed on time. I got ready for bed, but felt too unsettled to actually sleep. I could hear Caleb still stomping around downstairs. But strangely, within 10 minutes, I heard the front door open and close again. I waited a bit before creeping downstairs to check. Just as I suspected, Caleb had left before my mom even got off work, with his car also gone from the driveway. It was only around 10:30 p.m. at this point, making his exit even more alarming. Had he left for some innocuous reason, surely he would have let my mom know. She wasn't due home until midnight, so I spent the next anxious hours waiting for her return. As soon as she walked in, I told her everything that had happened with Caleb acting shady, his odd visitor, and leaving without notice. She could tell how freaked out I was and promised she believed me. She agreed it was highly irresponsible to abandon his duties like that. The next morning, she tried calling Caleb, but it went straight to voicemail. My mom reached out to her friend and coworker, Caleb's mom, looking for answers. She claimed Caleb had come home early feeling suddenly ill. But this reasoning made little sense. If sickness was the issue, he easily could have contacted my mom himself instead of the unexplained disappearance. In the weeks after, my mom thankfully never hired Caleb again to watch me. We eventually changed babysitters to a high school girl I actually liked. But the bizarreness of that night stayed etched in my mind. I found myself obsessing over what exactly Caleb had been up to. Who was the mystery visitor and what was in that bag they argued over? Why leave in such a rush if he wasn't doing something sketchy or illegal? I replayed it constantly, trying to make sense of things. Caleb remained an enigma that I never saw or heard from again. Nearly 10 years later, when I was finishing college, Caleb's name suddenly popped up in a news article that sent a chill down my spine. Turns out he had been under investigation for drug trafficking and was one of the suspects arrested in a big sting operation. Based on the details provided, detectives believed he had been using his babysitting gigs as a cover to make exchanges and deliveries. Everything clicked into place, and I realized just how much danger I could have unknowingly been around that one strange night. Caleb likely had drugs, cash, or both stowed away in that bag by the trash cans. It made sense why he seemed so stressed trying to coordinate the rushed meeting and exchanges with his friend. All the secrecy and lies were to conceal his illegal activities, even putting those under his supervision at risk. Looking back, I'm grateful I was perceptive enough as a kid to recognize something wasn't right with Caleb, even if I couldn't pinpoint exactly what. While my uneasiness failed to convince my mom at the time, the bizarre events of that night remained etched in my brain until the troubling truth finally emerged years later. I shudder to think what worse trouble Caleb could have dragged me into if I had been less skeptical of his lies and secrecy. My survival instinct detected early on that underneath his harmless facade lurked a hidden sinister side, a darkness that one night offered just a brief glimpse into.